In the quiet suburbs of California during the 1970s, life seemed safe. Families moved into newly built homes with white picket fences. Children played in the streets until the sun went down. Couples enjoyed the comfort of peaceful neighborhoods. America's Golden State was living up to its name, a land of sunshine, opportunity, and the promise of security. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was gathering. A predator lurked in the shadows, one who would terrorize entire communities for over a decade. He was cunning, calculating, and cruel beyond comprehension. He would become known by many names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, the name that history would remember, the Golden State Killer. This is the beginning of his story. The 1970s in California was an era of transformation. The state had seen explosive growth in the decades after World War II. Suburbs expanded outward from cities like Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Middle-class families found affordable homes in sprawling neighborhoods, often bordered by orchards, fields, and quiet country roads. Yet this sense of openness carried with it hidden vulnerabilities. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin across expanding communities. Police departments often worked independently, with little coordination between counties. Forensic technology was limited. DNA testing, which would later play a crucial role in solving the case, did not exist. Communities trusted their safety to locked doors and neighborhood watch groups, but for the kind of predator about to emerge, locks were never enough. This was the environment that allowed the Golden State Killer to thrive, a society unprepared for a criminal of such sophistication. When the crimes began, no one knew the man's name. No one could even be sure that the series of attacks were connected. What they did know, however, was chilling. The intruder would stalk his victims for days, sometimes weeks. He often broke into homes beforehand, moving small objects or unlocking windows. At night, he would strike, wearing a ski mask, gloves, and often carrying a flashlight to blind his victims. His voice was cold, commanding, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting. To the public, he was a ghost. To investigators, he was a nightmare. To his victims, he was terror itself. The story begins in Visalia, California, in 1974. Visalia was a small agricultural town, far from the bustling cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco. It was quiet, a place where neighbors knew each other and crime rates were low. That changed when a series of burglaries began. The burglar seemed to have strange habits. He often entered homes while families were away. Instead of stealing valuables, he would rummage through personal belongings. He would take sentimental items like photographs or trinkets, while leaving behind cash or expensive jewelry. Drawers were emptied, women's underwear stolen, furniture rearranged. It was not the work of a typical burglar. It was the work of someone who wanted to unsettle, to violate, to terrify. The residents of Visalia began calling him the Ransacker. Over 100 homes were burglarized, and then the crimes escalated. Criminologists often describe the progression of violent offenders as a cycle: fantasy, preparation, and escalation. The Visalia Ransacker seemed to follow this pattern perfectly. Fantasy. Breaking into homes gave him power, control, and a thrill. Preparation. He refined his methods, learning to bypass locks, avoid alarms, and move silently. Escalation. Petty theft was not enough. His hunger for control grew. In September 1975, the Ransacker's crimes reached a horrifying peak. A local man, Claude Snelling, confronted the masked intruder who was attempting to kidnap his daughter. Snelling was shot and killed. This was no longer a burglar. This was a murderer. The Visalia Ransacker disappeared soon after. Police never caught him. Many believe this marked the transition of the criminal into his next phase: the East Area Rapist. By the mid-1970s, Sacramento was booming. Neighborhoods spread outward, filled with young couples, professionals, and families seeking the American dream. But soon, reports began surfacing of a masked intruder terrorizing these new communities. He entered homes late at night. He targeted couples, forcing men to lie face down while he assaulted women. He tied his victims with ligatures, often improvising with shoelaces. He ransacked the home as though savoring the fear he had created. The crimes shocked investigators. They bore similarities to the Visalia Ransacker, the prowling, the burglaries, the stalking. But now, the violence had escalated into a reign of terror. The Sacramento community was gripped by fear. Families began buying guard dogs and weapons. Hardware stores reported record sales of locks, window bars, and security systems. Couples refused to sleep in separate rooms. Neighbors formed watch groups, communicating by walkie-talkies and phones. Despite all these efforts, the attacker remained elusive. He struck again and again, moving silently through backyards, creeks, and darkened alleys. He seemed to know the neighborhoods better than the police themselves. The newspapers began calling him the East Area Rapist. He wasn't just a rapist. He was a stalker, a sadist, and a phantom. Law enforcement faced enormous challenges. Jurisdictional barriers. Sacramento police, sheriff's departments, and nearby counties often failed to coordinate. The attacker moved between regions, exploiting these gaps. Lack of technology. Without DNA testing, investigators had to rely on blood types, shoe prints, and vague eyewitness accounts. Media pressure. The press sensationalized the case, sometimes releasing details that hindered the investigation. Public panic. The pressure on police grew unbearable. Politicians demanded answers. Citizens demanded protection. But the East Area Rapist always seemed to stay one step ahead. What made this offender so terrifying was not only the brutality of his attacks, but also the way he manipulated fear itself. He would call victims before and after attacks, whispering chilling threats like, "I'll be watching you." He taunted police with letters and phone calls. He studied his victims meticulously, sometimes breaking into their homes days before an attack. This was not random violence. This was control. This was dominance. And it was only the beginning. By the early 1980s, the crimes escalated again. The East Area Rapist moved south to Southern California, where his attacks turned deadly. Couples were murdered in their homes. Communities from Irvine to Ventura lived in fear of the man now known as the original Night Stalker. But at this point in history, investigators did not yet know that the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker were the same man. To them, these were separate criminals. Only decades later, with advances in DNA technology, would they discover the horrifying truth. All of these crimes were connected, and they were committed by one man. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror began quietly, almost invisibly, in a small agricultural town. But like a spreading wildfire, his crimes grew larger, darker, and deadlier. From burglaries in Visalia, to rapes in Sacramento, to murders across Southern California, the predator was evolving. And California was about to realize that it was facing not just a criminal, but one of the most dangerous serial offenders in American history. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. Visalia, California, a quiet agricultural town nestled in the San Joaquin Valley. Known for its farmland, orchards, and small-town atmosphere, it was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors trusted one another. But in 1974, Visalia would become the stage for one of the earliest and most chilling chapters in the Golden State Killer's reign of terror. Before he became the East Area Rapist, before he became the original Night Stalker, he was the Visalia Ransacker. And in Visalia, his twisted journey of terror first began to take shape. To understand the impact of the Visalia Ransacker, we first need to understand Visalia itself during the mid-1970s. The city had a population of around 37,000, large enough to feel like a city, but small enough that crime was rare and quickly noticed. The San Joaquin Valley was primarily agricultural. Farming was the backbone of the economy. Families often left their homes unlocked, confident that crime happened in bigger cities, not here. This illusion of safety was about to be shattered. In 1974, Reports of unusual burglaries began to reach the Visalia Police Department. At first, they seemed like ordinary property crimes. But as detectives examined the details, a disturbing pattern emerged. Personal belongings targeted. Instead of stealing money or electronics, the burglar took items of sentimental value: photographs, trinkets, ID cards, and women's underwear. Ransacking behavior. Homes were left in chaos. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, clothing strewn across the floor. Odd selectivity. Expensive jewelry or cash was often ignored. This was not a burglar stealing for profit. This was someone motivated by power, obsession, and psychological satisfaction. Over time, the number of burglaries attributed to the ransacker grew into the hundreds. Citizens began to realize they were dealing with something far darker than petty theft. Criminologists studying the Visalia Ransacker often note his behavior as an early glimpse into the mind of the future Golden State Killer. His burglaries revealed a disturbing psychology. Control. By moving and rearranging objects, he showed dominance over his victims' most private spaces. Violation. Stealing underwear and personal effects suggested a sexual motive, even without direct contact. Escalation. Each burglary seemed to bring him closer to confrontation. He wasn't just stealing, he was practicing. Community fear. As burglaries increased, the Visalia community entered a state of growing unease. Families started installing new locks and security lights. Neighborhoods organized patrols, with volunteers keeping watch at night. Parents warned their children about staying out too late. For the first time, this peaceful town felt under siege. The Visalia Police Department was overwhelmed. They had never faced a criminal like this before. Detectives began tracking break-ins, attempting to identify patterns in the ransacker's methods. They noted that he often struck in clusters, hitting multiple homes in the same neighborhood within weeks. Stakeouts were attempted, but the ransacker always seemed one step ahead. Frustration grew within the department. The burglaries seemed endless, and the suspect remained a ghost. The Visalia Ransacker's crimes reached a terrifying new level on September 11, 1975. That night, he attempted to kidnap the teenage daughter of a local college professor, Claude Snelling. When Snelling confronted the masked intruder, he was shot and killed in his own driveway. The ransacker fled, leaving behind his first known murder victim. This moment marked a critical escalation. He had gone from burglary to attempted kidnapping, from intimidation to outright violence, from psychological violation to murder. Visalia was horrified. The ransacker was no longer just a burglar. He was a killer. Following the murder of Claude Snelling, law enforcement intensified their pursuit. The ransacker, however, was cunning. In December 1975, police nearly captured him during a late-night stakeout. An officer spotted a masked man prowling a neighborhood and attempted to intercept him. A chase ensued, and the officer fired his weapon, striking the suspect. But in the confusion of the night, the ransacker managed to escape. Investigators were left with a haunting possibility. They had come face to face with the killer and lost him. After that near capture, the Visalia Ransacker vanished. The burglaries stopped. The terror seemed to end as suddenly as it began. But in reality, this disappearance was not an end. It was a transformation. Not long after the ransacker vanished, a new predator emerged hundreds of miles north in Sacramento. He was more violent, more organized, and far more terrifying. The East Area Rapist had arrived. At the time, police did not link the Visalia Ransacker to the East Area Rapist. It would take decades, and the advent of DNA technology, before investigators could piece the puzzle together. The stalking behaviors, the ransacking of homes, the psychological obsession with domination, all were trademarks of the same man. The Visalia Ransacker was the first mask worn by the Golden State Killer. The quiet town of Visalia never fully recovered from the shadow of the ransacker. For the families who lost loved ones and the victims who endured the violation of their homes, the scars remained. And for California, the Visalia Ransacker was just the beginning of a nightmare. A predator had tested his methods, built his confidence, and taken his first life. Now, he was ready for the next phase. From Visalia's orchards to Sacramento's suburbs, the Golden State Killer's evolution was underway. By the mid-1970s, California was already uneasy. The Zodiac had haunted San Francisco earlier in the decade. The Visalia Ransacker had terrorized neighborhoods in the Central Valley. But in 1976, a new predator emerged, one who would eclipse nearly all others in both scale and cruelty. This figure would become known as the East Area Rapist, EAR. Operating primarily in the suburban neighborhoods of Sacramento County, the EAR unleashed a campaign of fear that shook communities to their core. He broke into homes, stalked his victims, and committed brutal sexual assaults, often while the victims' husbands, boyfriends, or family members were present. His crimes weren't just about violence. They were about domination, humiliation, and control. By the time his reign of terror in Sacramento was over, he had attacked at least 50 women and couples. This period marked one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. Sacramento in the mid-1970s was, on the surface, the picture of suburban bliss. Middle-class families lived in new developments with freshly paved streets, cul-de-sacs, and tidy lawns. Many of the homes were single-story ranch-style houses with sliding glass doors and large windows, easy access points that would later prove disastrous. It was a place where people felt safe enough to leave doors unlocked, children rode bikes freely, and neighbors knew each other's names. But beneath this idyllic setting, fear would soon take root. The EAR turned the sense of safety upside down, making suburban Sacramento a place where locks, alarms, and fear became daily necessities. The EAR's first confirmed attack occurred on June 18, 1976, in Rancho Cordova, a suburb of Sacramento. The victim was a teenage girl home alone. He broke into the house, threatened her with a knife, and raped her. This crime was only the beginning. Police at first treated the case as an isolated incident, but within weeks, another attack occurred, similar in style and brutality. Then another, and another. By the end of 1976, there were at least 10 confirmed victims. From the start, investigators noticed patterns. The EAR's methods were chillingly consistent. Pre-attack surveillance. He stalked neighborhoods for days or even weeks. Neighbors often recalled seeing a strange man peeking through windows or hearing unexplained noises in the night. Entry. He favored sliding glass doors, prying them open silently. Sometimes, he entered homes hours before the attack, unlocking windows or planting ropes and bindings to use later. Masks and disguise. He wore ski masks, balaclavas, or simple cloth masks to hide his face. Victims often described his voice as high-pitched, sometimes forced into a whisper or growl. Weapons and threats. He carried knives, guns, or blunt weapons. His threats were specific and terrifying. "Don't move or I'll kill you." Binding. Victims were bound with shoelaces, cords, or ropes. If a male partner was present, he was tied up, sometimes stacked with plates on his back, so that any movement would alert the attacker. Control and humiliation. He would assault women repeatedly, pacing the room, rummaging through the refrigerator, or eating food in the kitchen between attacks. His control was psychological as much as physical. Escape. He slipped away into the night, sometimes running through backyards, jumping fences, or disappearing into bike trails and greenbelts. By 1977, the EAR had become Sacramento's most feared criminal. That year alone, he attacked more than 24 women. His crimes grew bolder. He targeted couples more frequently, challenging traditional notions of safety within the home. In several cases, victims reported hearing noises days before, like tapping on windows or finding screen doors tampered with. The community lived in constant dread. Gun sales skyrocketed. People organized neighborhood watches. Still, the EAR struck again and again. Police patrols increased. Helicopters scanned the skies at night. But he always seemed one step ahead. Sacramento residents lived in terror. Newspapers dubbed him the East Area Rapist, and headlines tracked his every move. Women slept with guns under their pillows. Couples set up booby traps in their homes. Parents warned children not to walk alone. The sense of suburban security was shattered. Even the wealthiest neighborhoods were not immune. Nowhere felt safe. The Sacramento Sheriff's Department took the lead on the case, but the scale quickly overwhelmed them. Hundreds of detectives were involved over the years, but the EAR's ability to vanish baffled them. He left behind shoe prints, ropes, and sometimes fingerprints, but never enough for an arrest. Bloodhounds occasionally tracked his scent to a road, where it seemed he had parked a getaway vehicle. Other times, dogs lost his trail in greenbelts or fields. The FBI was eventually consulted, but even federal resources provided no breakthrough. His attacks were too random, too spread out. One chilling pattern was his targeting of military families. Several victims' husbands were in the Air Force, stationed at nearby bases. Investigators wondered, was he a serviceman himself? Did he have military training? His physical fitness, discipline, and tactical approach suggested it. For nearly 2 years, the EAR had been a rapist and burglar. But on February 2, 1978, he escalated to murder. Brian Maggiore, a young Air Force sergeant, and his wife Katie were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova when they encountered the EAR. Something went wrong. Perhaps they recognized him, or he feared exposure. He shot and killed them both. Their dog ran off into the night. This double murder shocked investigators. The EAR was no longer just a rapist. He was now a killer. Even after the Maggiore murders, the EAR continued his assaults. Victims described the same methods: whispered threats, bindings, multiple assaults, rummaging through homes. His geography expanded too, stretching beyond Sacramento into Modesto, Stockton, and Contra Costa County. He was evolving, growing more dangerous, more mobile. By mid-1979, the East Area Rapist seemed to disappear from Sacramento. But in truth, he had only shifted locations. His crimes would soon appear hundreds of miles away in Southern California, where he would become known by yet another name, the original Night Stalker. But before that transformation, Sacramento had already endured years of trauma. For those who lived through it, the EAR was not just a headline. He was a nightly terror. Doors were bolted, windows nailed shut, and neighborhoods lived in fear of the footsteps outside their homes. The East Area Rapist era marked one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and sheer audacity made him nearly impossible to catch. For Sacramento, those years between 1976 and 1979 remain a haunting reminder of how quickly safety can vanish and how long shadows can last. The story of the EAR did not end here. It merely shifted southward into an even darker phase. The crimes would grow bloodier, the body count higher, and the mystery of the man behind the mask would deepen. This is where the East Area Rapist became the original Night Stalker, a killer whose legacy would haunt California for decades. By the late 1970s, California's fear was already deeply rooted in the crimes of the East Area Rapist. Suburban families slept uneasily, deadbolts reinforced, guard dogs purchased, and neighborhood watch groups patrolled. But the nightmare was far from over. As the decade closed and the 1980s dawned, the predator evolved. No longer content with stalking, binding, and raping, the man once known only as the East Area Rapist escalated into something darker, deadlier. He became a killer. Authorities would later call him the original Night Stalker, ONS, to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, the infamous 1980s serial killer who was also labeled the Night Stalker by the press. But for the communities of Southern California, where this new wave of murders erupted, the name mattered less than the horror he inflicted. He was a ghost in the night, a shadow who slipped past alarm systems, a murderer who shattered the sanctity of home. This chapter explores that chilling transformation, the East Area Rapist's descent into murder, the escalation of his sadism, the terror he unleashed across Southern California, and the dogged but frustrating investigation that left more questions than answers for decades. The last confirmed East Area Rapist attack took place in 1979 in Contra Costa County. After that, the attacks seemed to stop. For investigators, it felt as though the Phantom had finally gone silent, or perhaps had been incarcerated for another crime. But in 1979, a new string of violent crimes began, hundreds of miles south in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. These weren't just burglaries or rapes, they were murders. The MO bore striking similarities. Houses broken into at night, victims bound, couples targeted, sadistic control games played. But unlike in Sacramento, where he left his victims alive to recount their terror, the Southern California predator left only silence and corpses. It took years before police finally connected the dots, that the East Area Rapist and the new killer stalking SoCal suburbs were one and the same. Together, his crimes would later form the umbrella of the Golden State Killer. The ONS's attacks showed a terrifying pattern. Stalking. He often prowled neighborhoods days or weeks before a strike, sometimes breaking into homes to unlock windows or disable alarms. Bindings. He continued his practice of using ligatures, often pre-cut, sometimes using shoelaces or drapery cords. Victims were usually bound hand and foot. Taunts and control. Survivors of the EAR had described his need for dominance, whispering, threatening, even crying or laughing bizarrely during attacks. Though few lived to describe his ONS persona, the crime scenes suggested the same sadistic control. Escalation to murder. When victims resisted or circumstances shifted, he killed, often by bludgeoning with a blunt object from the house itself, such as a piece of firewood. This transition represented the ultimate escalation. A man who began as a burglar, grew into a prolific rapist, and then became a serial killer. One of the most tragic aspects of the ONS crimes was the disjointed investigation. In the late 1970s and 1980s, DNA testing was still in its infancy. Police departments in Sacramento, Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties often worked independently, failing to see the connections. Each department had pieces of the puzzle, but without statewide coordination, the broader picture remained elusive. Compounding this was the killer's ability to adapt. Unlike some serial killers who stick to narrow hunting grounds, the ONS moved frequently across counties, making it harder to track him. He struck in wealthy, low-crime neighborhoods, blindsiding communities that thought themselves safe. It wasn't until the 1990s, with advances in DNA profiling, that investigators were able to confirm that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. This realization was groundbreaking. A single offender was responsible for dozens of rapes and at least 10 murders. Criminal profilers described the ONS as methodical, organized, and compulsively controlling. He likely had a background that gave him knowledge of law enforcement tactics or military/police procedures, given his ability to evade capture and control crime scenes. He was believed to be in his late 20s to mid-30s during the EAR era, which placed him in his 30s and 40s during the ONS murders. Psychologists pointed out the escalation as evidence of deepening pathology. He had evolved from voyeurism to burglary, from rape to murder. His need for dominance was absolute. By killing, he ensured complete control. No witnesses, no resistance. As murders mounted, fear spread like wildfire. Wealthy suburban families who thought themselves untouchable realized they were vulnerable. Gun sales spiked. Families installed alarms and new locks. In some neighborhoods, husbands slept in shifts, keeping watch over their families. The memory of the East Area Rapist's reign of terror in Sacramento returned. Only now, the stakes were higher, the violence irreversible. Rumors and theories spread. Some believed multiple killers were at work. Others thought the ONS was a cop, given his precision. The truth remained elusive, hidden in the darkness of California's most affluent suburbs. After the murder of Janelle Cruz in 1986, the original Night Stalker seemed to disappear. No further murders matching his MO were reported. For decades, his silence baffled investigators. Did he die? Did he go to prison for another crime? Did he simply stop? Whatever the reason, the trail went cold. The murders joined the rapes of the EAR era as unsolved cases, haunting police files, and the communities left devastated. By the late 1980s, the East Area Rapist original Night Stalker had committed a staggering series of crimes. Over 50 rapes, more than 100 burglaries, and at least 10 murders. He had evolved into one of the most dangerous predators in American history, yet he remained unidentified, a ghost in the system. The transition into murder marked not just an escalation in violence, but a shift in his legacy. No longer was he just a rapist stalking Sacramento suburbs. He was a statewide menace, a killer who left bloodied families in his wake. The story of the Golden State Killer was far from over. The coming decades would bring new technology, renewed investigations, and eventually a shocking revelation about the man behind the mask. But for the victims of the ONS era, justice remained painfully out of reach. When the crimes of the Golden State Killer unfolded across California in the 1970s and 1980s, law enforcement officers faced challenges that today might seem almost unimaginable. Modern readers, accustomed to instant DNA matches, digital databases, and real-time communication across police departments, sometimes forget just how fractured, slow, and bureaucratic investigations were in that era. Back then, California law enforcement was decentralized. Every city had its own police force, every county its sheriff's department, and every jurisdiction its own way of collecting and filing information. There was no single database to track crimes across regions. If a serial predator committed an attack in one county and then drove 50 miles to another city to strike again, there was no automatic connection between the cases. Each department worked in relative isolation unless someone deliberately reached out and compared notes. This fragmentation was perhaps the greatest obstacle investigators faced. For the Golden State Killer, it became his greatest shield. He struck in Sacramento, then Contra Costa, then Santa Barbara, then Orange County. The patchwork law enforcement system gave him room to maneuver, and time after time, crucial links between cases were missed or delayed. Complicating matters further was the sheer volume of crimes. In Sacramento alone, during the mid-1970s, burglaries and sexual assaults were not rare. The East Area Rapists' attacks, though shocking in their frequency and brutality, were not immediately distinguishable from other crimes. When he escalated to murder in Southern California, investigators suddenly found themselves staring at a different picture. But by then, years of miscommunication and missed opportunities had piled up. It wasn't just the system, it was also the tools. Police had fingerprinting and ballistics. They had sketch artists. They had shoe print comparisons. But they did not have DNA analysis. They could not enter a name into a computer and instantly retrieve an interconnected web of case histories. Detectives often relied on gut instinct, interviews, and slowly cross-referencing notes. In such a system, a clever offender who varied his methods just enough could evade recognition for years. The Golden State Killer understood this, consciously or not. He changed his hunting grounds often. He shifted tactics. He taunted police in letters, knowing they could not easily trace him. And he thrived in the confusion, leaving behind not just victims, but entire departments of frustrated detectives. Sacramento was the epicenter of the East Area Rapist phase, and from 1976 to 1979, law enforcement worked tirelessly to identify and capture him. Community meetings were held. Citizens were warned to lock doors and windows. Patrol cars prowled suburban neighborhoods at night. But detectives hit wall after wall. They interviewed thousands of people, followed hundreds of leads, and yet no breakthrough came. The man was simply too careful. He wore masks. He wore gloves. He controlled his crime scenes. He often struck in neighborhoods he had cased for weeks, learning escape routes and police patrol patterns. One infamous moment of investigation difficulty came when the rapist phoned victims before or after attacks. Sometimes the calls were recorded, such as the chilling, "I'll kill you" whisper that later surfaced. Yet even with voice analysis, police had no way to match it to a suspect unless someone was already identified. The most frustrating aspect was the lack of regional cooperation. While Sacramento police pursued their rapist, investigators in Contra Costa County were facing eerily similar crimes. At first, the dots weren't connected. Even when suspicions grew, it took years before a task force was formally created. Each jurisdiction had pride, turf wars, and its own way of doing things. For victims, this bureaucratic slowness was devastating. For the rapist, it was freedom. By the late 1970s, the East Area Rapists seemed to vanish. Then, in 1979, brutal homicides began surfacing in Southern California. Couples were being bludgeoned, sometimes bound with shoelaces. Homes in Santa Barbara, Irvine, and Orange County became crime scenes of unspeakable violence. Detectives in these regions were horrified by the crimes, but they initially did not connect them to the East Area Rapist of Northern California. The MO had similarities: bindings, control, surprise attacks. But the escalation to murder was so extreme that many assumed they were dealing with a different predator altogether. Santa Barbara County detectives pored over their cases. Orange County formed its own teams. But information sharing between North and South remained limited. The crucial realization that the East Area Rapist and the Southern California original Night Stalker were the same person came only years later. By then, opportunities for early capture had long slipped away. This disconnection is one of the most tragic aspects of the investigation. Victims were dying in the South, while clues from the North remained siloed. If databases like today's CODIS had existed, the links might have been obvious. Instead, the case sprawled into chaos. The Golden State Killer case didn't just haunt detectives, it terrified communities. Newspapers published updates. Television ran nightly reports. Rumors spread like wildfire. He drove a white van. He was a police officer. He only attacked homes with sliding glass doors. He called victims months later to terrorize them. For law enforcement, the media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, publicity brought tips. On the other, it generated false leads by the thousands. Every man who resembled a police sketch was reported. Every prank call, every strange noise in the neighborhood became potential evidence. Detectives were drowning in data but starving for clarity. Meanwhile, the rapist killer seemed to enjoy the coverage. He watched the fear unfold. Some theorize he attended community meetings, blending in with worried residents as police briefed the public on safety. Others believe he deliberately read the newspapers to see what police knew. The pressure on detectives was enormous. Communities demanded answers. Politicians wanted progress. But behind the scenes, investigators were exhausted. They worked long nights, followed dead ends, and often found themselves circling back to the same handful of suspects, none of whom panned out. As the 1980s and 1990s progressed, forensic science evolved. DNA became a tool. Cold cases were reopened. Slowly, the possibility of linking crimes by biological evidence emerged. For the Golden State Killer investigation, DNA proved revolutionary, but also late. By the time investigators confirmed through DNA that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same, decades had passed. The killer had retired, vanished into anonymity. The trail had gone cold. One of the most haunting realizations was how close investigators had come. Time and time again, witnesses had seen his face in glimpses. Patrol cars had nearly crossed paths with him after attacks. Composite sketches looked uncannily like Joseph DeAngelo. Yet without DNA confirmation, those moments remained near misses. Even as late as the 1990s, suspects were tested and cleared. Arthur Lee Allen, once suspected of being the Zodiac, was even speculated upon by amateur sleuths in relation to the EAR/ONS crimes. But no match ever came back. The killer's identity remained elusive. By the 2000s, the case had become legendary among cold case detectives. Task forces were formed, conferences were held, retired investigators kept files in their garages, unable to let go of the mystery. But the years had taken a toll. Witness memories faded, evidence degraded, and many detectives who had once chased the killer retired or passed away. Still, the case refused to die. Online forums picked up the torch. Amateur investigators began combing through old articles, police reports, and theories. The name Golden State Killer, coined by writer Michelle McNamara, gave the case a fresh identity and galvanized public attention. Law enforcement had struggled for decades, But they had not failed entirely. Their preservation of evidence, particularly biological samples, would prove critical. It was these painstakingly saved items, left in storage for years, that would ultimately unlock the truth. The Golden State Killer investigation was, above all, a story of struggle. Struggle against bureaucracy, against outdated technology, against human error and exhaustion. Detectives chased shadows, endured ridicule, and often felt they were fighting a ghost. Yet they kept going. They never closed the case, even when hope seemed lost. The struggles of the investigation highlight a sobering truth. Sometimes justice requires patience measured not in days or years, but in decades. The killer had eluded capture in his prime. But thanks to persistence, science, and the refusal of victims and detectives to give up, his shadow would eventually be dragged into the light. By the late 20th century, law enforcement found itself standing at the edge of a technological revolution. The 1970s and 1980s had been defined by fingerprints, ballistics, and witness statements. But by the 1990s, a new tool had begun transforming criminal investigations: DNA analysis. The very idea that a criminal could be identified by microscopic traces of their biology, skin cells, saliva, hair, semen, seemed almost like science fiction when it was first introduced. Yet for detectives working on the cold, unsolved cases of the Golden State Killer, this emerging science offered something long missing: hope. For decades, the East Area Rapist / original Night Stalker had seemed invincible. He left behind countless crime scenes, dozens of witnesses, and entire police departments chasing shadows. But he also left behind DNA, and though the technology didn't exist to analyze it, in the 1970s, those biological samples were carefully preserved by forensic teams who couldn't have predicted how valuable they would become in the future. The revolution was slow at first. Early DNA testing was cumbersome, expensive, and required large amounts of genetic material. Many crime scenes, degraded by time, couldn't provide viable samples. But with each passing year, the science improved. By the 1990s, DNA evidence could link crimes to each other. By the early 2000s, it could identify individuals with astonishing precision. And by the 2010s, it could do something truly remarkable: reveal entire family trees. The Golden State Killer case, long thought unsolvable, was about to collide with the most powerful forensic tool in history. Before DNA, investigators debated whether the East Area Rapist and the Southern California Killer, dubbed the original Night Stalker, were the same man. Some thought the similarities too strong to ignore. Others argued the leap from burglary and rape to serial murder was too extreme. DNA ended the debate. In the early 2000s, forensic analysts compared biological evidence from crime scenes in Northern and Southern California. The results were conclusive. The same man had committed both sets of crimes. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were one predator. This revelation was groundbreaking. For the first time, investigators across California knew they were chasing the same suspect. The case, long fractured by jurisdictional boundaries, finally had a unified identity. But while DNA had linked the crimes, it had not identified the killer. That challenge remained. The profile was in the system, but no matches came back. Whoever he was, he had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. He was still a ghost. By the mid-2000s, a new development in consumer technology offered investigators a radical opportunity. Millions of people were submitting their DNA to commercial companies like Ancestry and 23andMe, curious about their heritage, their health predispositions, or simply their family history. While law enforcement could not directly access these private databases, a similar public platform existed: GEDmatch. Unlike commercial sites, GEDmatch allowed users to upload raw DNA files and compare them against others to find relatives. Amateur genealogists used it to build family trees. But detectives soon realized this tool could also be used to catch killers. By uploading an unknown suspect's DNA profile into GEDmatch, investigators could see if the genetic material matched with distant relatives. From there, genealogists could painstakingly construct family trees, narrowing down potential suspects based on age, location, and opportunity. This method, known as forensic genetic genealogy, was revolutionary. It allowed police not just to link crimes, but to identify suspects who had never been in the system. And in 2018, this method was about to change the Golden State Killer case forever. The team behind the breakthrough included a blend of traditional detectives and cutting-edge genealogists. One of the leading figures was Paul Holes, a Contra Costa County investigator who had spent decades obsessed with the case. He had followed the East Area Rapist trail since the 1990s, long after the attacks had stopped, and refused to let go. Holes and his team worked with genealogists to upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile into GED Match. To their relief, the system produced several distant matches, third and fourth cousins. These were not close enough to identify a suspect immediately, but they were enough to begin constructing possible family trees. The genealogists dug deep into public records, census data, marriage licenses, obituaries, social media. Piece by piece, they built out family histories stretching back generations, looking for the branch that would lead to a man of the right age, living in California during the years of the attacks. The process was grueling, but slowly the possibilities narrowed. One name began to emerge as chillingly plausible: Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, Sacramento. DeAngelo's name was not entirely new to law enforcement circles. Some investigators had speculated about him years earlier, given his law enforcement background and proximity to the crimes. But nothing had stuck. Now, through genealogy, the pieces aligned. DeAngelo had lived in the areas where the East Area Rapist struck. He had relocated to Southern California during the years of the murders. His age, background, and history all fit. But detectives needed proof. Genetic genealogy could point them toward DeAngelo, but it could not convict him. To secure an arrest, they required a direct DNA sample from the man himself. So investigators did what detectives often do in such situations. They surveilled him. In 2018, police followed DeAngelo, who was then in his 70s, as he went about his daily life. They collected discarded items he left behind: tissues, trash, even a handle from his car door. These samples were rushed to the lab. The results were definitive. The DNA from Joseph DeAngelo matched the DNA from the Golden State Killer crime scenes. After more than 4 decades, the ghost had a name. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested outside his suburban home in Citrus Heights. The man who had terrorized California for years was revealed to be a frail-looking former cop, a husband, a father, and a grandfather. Neighbors were stunned. To them, DeAngelo was quiet, sometimes grumpy, but unremarkable. No one suspected the kindly old man next door was one of America's most notorious criminals. The arrest made international headlines. After decades of fear, speculation, and investigative frustration, the Golden State Killer was unmasked. Victims wept. Detectives who had dedicated their lives to the case celebrated. And the public marveled at the power of DNA to finally solve a case that had seemed destined to remain a mystery. The capture of Joseph DeAngelo was not just the resolution of one of history's most infamous cold cases. It was a watershed moment for criminal investigations worldwide. Forensic genetic genealogy proved itself as a powerful new weapon in the fight against violent crime. In the years following DeAngelo's arrest, dozens of other cold cases, murders, rapes, and unidentified remains were solved using the same method. Families who had waited decades for answers finally found closure. But the method also sparked ethical debates. Should law enforcement be allowed to access genealogical databases intended for recreational use? What about privacy rights? Could innocent relatives be unfairly scrutinized because of distant DNA matches? Despite the debates, one truth was undeniable. The Golden State Killer case would never have been solved without DNA and genealogy. The revolution in forensics had given law enforcement the ability to reach into the past and pull a ghost into the light. When Joseph DeAngelo was led away in handcuffs, the case was not simply about one man's crimes. It was about the perseverance of detectives, the resilience of survivors, and the evolution of science itself. DNA had succeeded where everything else had failed. It had cut through decades of dead ends and false starts. It had turned whispers and theories into hard evidence. And it had reminded the world that technology, when combined with determination, can achieve the impossible. Yet even with the case closed, the shadow of the Golden State Killer remains. His crimes scarred California. His legacy still chills true crime enthusiasts. And the story of his capture continues to inspire new discussions about justice, technology, and the lengths we must go to uncover the truth. By the spring of 2018, decades of investigative persistence and the revolutionary power of DNA had finally pointed law enforcement to one man, Joseph James DeAngelo. For over 40 years, he had remained invisible, living quietly in suburban California while the world searched for the Golden State Killer. Detectives, genealogists, and scientists had meticulously built the case against him, narrowing their focus until his name stood out among thousands. But suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed absolute proof. DeAngelo's DNA had to be matched to the crime scene evidence preserved since the 1970s and 1980s. To do that, they needed to collect a fresh sample without alerting him. Surveillance teams were quietly assembled, their mission clear: follow him, observe his habits, and retrieve anything he discarded that might carry his DNA. For detectives who had lived with this case for most of their careers, the tension was almost unbearable. After so many years of false starts and dead ends, everything now hinged on one frail-looking man in his 70s. DeAngelo lived in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb northeast of Sacramento. His neighbors knew him as an irritable private man. He tinkered in his garage, rode his motorcycle, and occasionally erupted in loud arguments in his backyard. Few people paid him much attention, certainly not enough to guess that he was one of the most wanted criminals in American history. For weeks, investigators shadowed him. They watched as he ran errands, visited stores, and moved about his neighborhood. The goal was simple: wait for him to leave behind a piece of trash, a coffee cup, or anything else that contained his genetic material. Finally, in April 2018, the break came. Detectives retrieved a used tissue and items from DeAngelo's garbage. These were carefully rushed to the crime lab, where analysts compared the DNA to the samples taken from the Golden State Killer crime scenes decades earlier. The results were undeniable. The profile matched. The ghost who had haunted California since the 1970s now had a name, a face, and a confirmed identity: Joseph James DeAngelo. Once the DNA confirmed the match, law enforcement agencies across California coordinated the arrest. It was a moment of triumph, but also one requiring extreme caution. DeAngelo was a former police officer, trained in firearms and tactics. Even in his 70s, detectives feared he might resist violently if confronted. Careful plans were drawn up to ensure the arrest would be swift, safe, and overwhelming. Officers wanted to minimize the chance of bloodshed. After decades of waiting, they could not risk losing him in a moment of chaos. The chosen day was April 24th, 2018. Undercover teams took positions in Citrus Heights, surrounding DeAngelo's home. Neighbors were quietly warned to stay inside. The operation moved forward with precision. That evening, DeAngelo stepped out of his home. To him, it was another ordinary night in his quiet suburban life. To the assembled officers, it was the culmination of decades of pursuit. As he stood near his driveway, heavily armed officers moved in. They surrounded him in seconds, weapons drawn, voices commanding him to surrender. The old man who had once struck terror into entire communities froze. He was handcuffed without incident, his face blank, his body frail. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had finally been caught. The arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents who had lived beside DeAngelo for years stared in disbelief as police cars and tactical units crowded the street. The man they had dismissed as a cranky retiree was suddenly revealed to be a monster whose crimes stretched across California. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. Within hours, national and international media were broadcasting live from Citrus Heights. Reporters crowded the street outside DeAngelo's modest home. desperate to capture images of the man who had eluded justice for so long. For survivors and families of victims, the arrest was overwhelming. Some wept with relief. Others felt anger, knowing that the man who had destroyed so many lives had lived freely for decades. But for all, there was finally an answer. The face of the Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery. Investigators reflected on this surreal moment. Many had dedicated their entire careers to solving the case. Some had retired without answers. Now, at last, the long pursuit had ended. The capture was not just about justice. It was a victory for persistence, science, and the belief that no criminal, no matter how elusive, could hide forever. As detectives searched DeAngelo's home, they found a life that seemed both ordinary and sinister. The house was cluttered, with signs of a man who had grown reclusive in his later years. Neighbors recalled his strange habits, loud outbursts of anger, obsessive tinkering, and sudden mood swings. Yet nothing inside hinted at the scale of his crimes. There were no shrines, no trophies openly displayed, no overt signs of the terror he once inflicted. His secrets had been buried in the past, locked away in his own silence. Interviews with family members revealed a portrait of a man capable of compartmentalization. To them, he was difficult, sometimes cruel, but no one had imagined the depths of his darkness. His own daughters, horrified by the revelations, cut ties with him after the arrest. The capture of Joseph James DeAngelo was one of the most significant arrests in American criminal history. It represented not only the resolution of a decades-old case, but also the triumph of forensic science and persistence. For the survivors who had lived in fear, for the families who had mourned without answers, and for the investigators who had carried the weight of failure for so long, the moment was profound. At last, the Golden State Killer had a name. At last, justice had caught up with him. The arrest marked the beginning of the final chapter in the story. Ahead lay trials, sentencing, and the slow process of reckoning. But for April 24, 2018, one truth mattered above all others. Joseph James DeAngelo was no longer free. For over 4 decades, the Golden State Killer case hung like a storm cloud over California. Communities that had once been bound by suburban peace were fractured by fear. In Sacramento, Rancho Cordova, Goleta, Irvine, and countless other towns, the memory of home invasions, assaults, and murders shaped how generations locked their doors, lit their porches, and trusted their neighbors. The capture of Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018 finally put a name and a face to the phantom. Yet the long shadow of fear he cast did not vanish overnight. Survivors carried scars that would never fully heal. Families of victims continued to mourn lives stolen decades earlier. The broader community, though relieved, remained haunted by the knowledge that such evil had lived undetected among them for so long. Behind the statistics, over 50 rapes, 13 murders, and more than 100 burglaries, were real people. Survivors have spoken of waking up to the sound of breaking glass, of whispered threats in the dark, of ropes binding their wrists, and of the cold barrel of a gun pressed to their temple. For decades, many lived in silence, their trauma compounded by a culture that often blamed victims or minimized sexual violence. The capture and conviction of DeAngelo gave many of these survivors a chance to speak openly at last. In court, they confronted him directly, their voices breaking yet resolute. One by one, they reclaimed their stories, refusing to let his crimes define them any longer. These moments were not only about justice, they were about survival, resilience, and courage in the face of unimaginable terror. For the families of those murdered, the decades-long wait for answers was cruel. Parents died without knowing who had killed their children. Spouses grew old carrying grief that never lessened. In some cases, families became fractured, weighed down by suspicion, frustration, and hopelessness. The eventual arrest of DeAngelo brought a strange mix of relief and renewed sorrow. There was justice, yes, but also a reminder of all the years stolen, not just from the victims, but from the families left behind. The Golden State Killer had not only taken lives, he had taken futures, leaving holes that could never be filled. The investigation into the Golden State Killer is a testament to persistence. Hundreds of detectives, officers, forensic scientists, and journalists contributed over 4 decades. Some worked tirelessly in the 1970s and 1980s, following leads that seemed to vanish into smoke. Others picked up the case in the 1990s and 2000s, refusing to let it fade into the cold case archives. The story is also a cautionary tale about the limits of law enforcement. For years, jurisdictional boundaries prevented detectives from realizing they were chasing the same man. Rivalries between departments and bureaucratic inefficiencies slowed progress. If not for the revolutionary advances in DNA technology, DeAngelo may have remained hidden to this day. And yet, the case also demonstrates the value of refusing to surrender. Investigators like Paul Holes, Larry Crompton, and countless unnamed detectives carried the case forward. Their obsession, often ridiculed, became the very persistence that eventually cracked it open. The Golden State Killer case did more than solve one mystery. It ushered in a new era of forensic science. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo sparked a wave of similar breakthroughs across the United States. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were suddenly within reach. Families found answers after decades of silence. But the method also raised profound ethical questions. Should law enforcement be able to use consumer DNA databases intended for personal or recreational purposes? What are the boundaries of privacy in a digital age when the DNA you upload could inadvertently expose distant relatives to police scrutiny? Privacy advocates continue to warn of potential misuse, while law enforcement stresses the importance of balancing rights with justice. The Golden State Killer case became the test case for this debate, and its legacy will shape how forensic science evolves in the decades to come. The story of the Golden State Killer is no longer just true crime, it is cultural history. Books like I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara reignited public interest and introduced the case to new generations. Documentaries, podcasts, and films have dissected every detail, ensuring that the story will not fade. But more importantly, the case sparked conversations about sexual violence, survivor advocacy, and the resilience of communities. It exposed flaws in policing, but also highlighted how collaboration between journalists, amateur sleuths, genealogists, and police can achieve breakthroughs once thought impossible. The Golden State Killer has become a symbol of terror, yes, but also of perseverance, technology, and the pursuit of justice against all odds. Even with DeAngelo behind bars, the question remains, who was he, really? Was he the monster he appeared to be in his crimes? Or the quiet suburban neighbor who mowed his lawn and raised a family? How did a man sworn to uphold the law as a police officer transform into one of America's most prolific criminals? The answers are incomplete. DeAngelo himself has offered little. In court, he sat silently, occasionally muttering apologies, but never truly explaining why. Perhaps no explanation could ever suffice. Perhaps evil, in its purest form, resists comprehension. Yet studying DeAngelo's dual life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That predators can hide in plain sight, that institutions can fail to protect the vulnerable, and that the line between ordinary and monstrous may be thinner than we'd like to believe. The capture and sentencing of Joseph James DeAngelo delivered justice, but justice is not the same as closure. Survivors still live with memories that wake them in the night. Families still set empty places at dinner tables. Communities still remember the terror that once walked their streets. And yet, there is meaning in the resolution. The Golden State Killer was unmasked. He was stripped of anonymity, forced to face the voices of those he once silenced. In that, there is power. In that, there is a measure of healing. The case reminds us of the resilience of human beings, the ability to endure, to survive, and to keep demanding answers, even when decades pass without them. The Golden State Killer story is more than crime and punishment. It is a narrative about time, memory, technology, and human perseverance. It is about how one man's cruelty collided with the determination of thousands who refused to let him remain hidden. The legacy is complicated. It includes fear, trauma, and loss. But it also includes breakthroughs in science, greater awareness of survivor advocacy, and the reminder that even the darkest secrets can one day be brought into the light. For years, he was the faceless phantom, the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. He was the voice on the phone whispering threats. He was the shadow in the backyard, the footsteps in the hall, the masked figure who shattered suburban peace. Today, he is Joseph James DeAngelo, an old man in prison, stripped of power, his name forever tied not to the authority of a badge, but to the infamy of his crimes. The Golden State Killer is no longer a ghost. He is history. And his story, as horrifying as it is, stands as a warning and a testament that evil can hide in plain sight, but it cannot hide forever. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror stretched across decades, haunting countless lives. But in the end, his mask was ripped away, his crimes exposed, and his victims' voices rose louder than his silence. This is more than a story of darkness. It's a story of resilience, of science, and of the unrelenting pursuit of justice. The shadows he left behind will never fully fade, but the light of truth will always outlast fear. If you found this documentary powerful and informative, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our future deep dive stories. Your support helps us continue bringing untold true crime cases, history, and mysteries to light. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious.